August 7th, 1973. Albuquerque, New Mexico. A woman using her CB radio all the way in California would end up getting a message unlike any she had heard before. While scrolling the airways, she heard the faint cries for help that sounded like it was coming from a young boy. She stopped scrolling and started to talk to the boy, and what followed was a story about a boy named Larry being lost in the New Mexico desert with seemingly no way to get back home. What would follow this would be one of the most extensive searches in the history of the United States up to this point, only for searchers to find absolutely no trace of this boy's existence. Was this boy in fact real and left stranded and to die out in the desert? Perhaps was this some type of sick joke that went way too far? Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we explore an enduring mystery, one in which to this day we still don't have many answers for. What was responsible for the Lost Boy Larry broadcasts? Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and today's topic is a little bit of a combo of kind of like a missing persons case, but also with a little bit of true crime sprinkled in there as well. If you, at least you want to loop it in there. But this case is very, very interesting, and kind of a one-on-one in terms of, I've never heard of another case particularly like this one. And in researching this, it was quite a bit of fun, even though for as old and as widespread as this case was during the 1970s, a lot of the research that I did on this was through other content creators, as not really many websites still had really comprehensive stories, that went through every single step and every single part of the story, like the content creators out there. So obviously, I did a lot of my research through them for this week's topic, and it was very fun, and it was also challenging at the same time because of that. Now, some of you might have heard about this case before, and some of you may have not, and that's totally okay. Because how this episode is going to go is that I'm going to go into the story of the Lost Boy Larry broadcasts and the subsequent investigation. Then I want to go over another story of a missing person who can perhaps maybe provide some context to our whole entire story. And then at the very end, we will wrap it all up with some thoughts and theories, and kind of, again, my own personal 2 cents on the whole entire case and what I think actually could have happened here. But with that being said, let's get into the case of the Lost Boy Larry broadcasts. Now, our story heavily relies on the use of CB radio. And if you don't know what CB radio is, I'm going to give you a little background into what it is and how it works. You might be the most familiar with the CB radio, or you might have heard about it before, and that is because pretty much every single trucker used them to communicate from truck to truck in current times now. However, during their inception in the 1940s, and then commonly starting to be available to the public in the late 50s, these radios provided the everyday citizen with access to communication with other people over short distances of area through radio signals. The CB radio, CB standing from Citizens Band, gained increased popularity in the 1970s after the oil crisis within the United States. Truckers heavily relied on the CB radio to communicate to other drivers about fuel stations that actually had gas. And this opened the door for everyday citizens to use them, as they also became more popular in film and in Hollywood. Now, you have to think about this as well. This perhaps was another method of communication that was given to the American people since the invention of the telephone. And if you really think about it, you could go on to one of these CB radios and get in touch with anyone within a short distance and connect with them. It was kind of like social media of the 1970s and 80s, in kind of a unique, different way. Many people within the United States were active CB radio operators and made little handles for themselves and even hosted local CB radio shows. So needless to say that during the time of the Lost Boy Larry broadcasts, they were very, very popular. Now, our story starts on August 7th, 1973, not yet in New Mexico, but rather in Fontana, California, in the home of Darlene Ross. Ross, like many people during this time, frequently used her CB radio to chat with others over the airways, as well as listen to the different frequencies on it. Now, while scrolling through the channels on her CB radio, she heard the voice of a young boy who sounded distressed. Obviously, this stood out to her, and she wanted to see what this was about. and not knowing, of course, if somebody was in danger. She flicked the channel back to the one that she thought she had heard the voice on, and heard a faint "help, please help me" that was mixed in with other static from the radio. She was able to get the radio to settle on this strange broadcast of this young boy calling for help, and Darlene was then able to ask the boy on the other end of the radio a series of questions. Now, the boy on the other end of the line began telling Darlene Ross about what was going on. The young boy, who said his name was Larry, told Darlene that him and his father were driving in a red pickup truck when his father had a medical emergency of some kind, and the truck overturned and crashed, and he was trapped inside. Firstly, before we continue, if in case this did happen, this would obviously be a deeply traumatic experience, and the know-how to and just be a kid and have that know-how to get on the CB radio and attempt to call for help is very smart. But of course, we will get into a lot more information and possible loopholes in regard to this story, and, even some things, not quite lining up too, but let's continue with the story. Larry told Darlene that he was under the impression that his father had a heart attack behind the wheel, and after some prodding from Darlene, the boy confessed that he was 7 years old, but he never gave out his last name. Even though the prodding for information that Darlene did, he would not give up his last name or even remotely come close to telling her what it was. Now, Darlene said there were times in which it was very hard to hear Larry over the broadcast because not only was there a mix of radio static, Larry was crying profusely on the other end of the line, making his words sometimes very tough to hear and make out. However, Darlene did say that she heard Larry say the following phrase, and I quote, "Come on, David, help me." Now, it is unclear who Larry is talking to at this moment, because our best guess is that Larry is the only one here in this moment, and it calls into question perhaps he was talking to multiple people over the airway at the same time, perhaps. Could there have been really someone else in the car that he didn't tell Darlene about? Now, regardless, that statement doesn't make a whole lot of sense. At least, not right now, it doesn't. Now, Larry would go on to tell Darlene that he was in New Mexico, which is pretty impressive distance in terms of CB radio waves, because Darlene was receiving this message in Fontana, California. Now, eventually Larry's voice would fade into the radio waves, not before Darlene promised Larry that she would get help to try and find him. Now, Darlene's next course of action would be to get in touch with the Albuquerque Journal newspaper. Why she got in touch with them first, I'm not quite sure. I don't know why she wouldn't just contact New Mexico State Police instead, but that's not really super important to our story. Darlene contacted the Albuquerque Journal newspaper, told them the story about Larry, and then the newspaper then relayed the message to New Mexico State Police and authorities, and a search was launched to try and locate Larry. Now, shortly after the news broke about the lost boy in the New Mexico desert, many news sites picked up on the story and started running stories in the paper all about it, and it generated quite the stir and buzz all over the place. It had people turning into their CB radios all across the area trying to hear a glimpse of Larry over the radio, and they had good reason to, because as it turns out, people were hearing Larry's broadcasts all over the place. It turns out that Larry's broadcasts were being seen in a plethora of states, and that doesn't mean just New Mexico, but they're also being heard in California, Arizona, Wyoming, Mississippi, and even parts of Canada. And you might be wondering how, at all, is that possible that a CB radio could even travel that distance? And don't worry, we will go all over that a little bit later, so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind for now. However, one quick theory has been proposed for this, and that being a phenomenon known as ionospheric skip, where when weather conditions are perfect, radio waves can bounce off the ionosphere of the Earth and then reflect back down, allowing your radio waves to travel further distances. Of course, just keep that in the back of your mind for now, as I will kind of circle back when we discuss theories a little bit later. Now, law enforcement started to search the New Mexico area for any sign of Larry. However, they didn't really have much to go on. They had set up designated listening stations throughout the state to try and see if searchers could catch a bit of Larry's broadcasts, and hopefully, through making contact with him, they could narrow the search down or track his broadcast location. However, that was much easier said than done. Those who made contact with Larry had to overcome a series of hurdles. Oftentimes, the story being given by Larry was not consistent. Sometimes his story would include the same one he told to Darlene Ross about the overturned truck, and then other times his story would mention that he was either outside of the truck, unharmed and not trapped, and then sometimes he would be trapped, but also with his father still alive and not dead by this apparent health issue that he mentioned in the very first broadcast. In addition to this, Larry would often jump from channel to channel on his broadcasts, making it incredibly hard to trace him. Now, like I just mentioned, he's not making it any easy for people to find him, and of course you could say that maybe that's him, maybe because that's not real, but of course we will go over that a little bit later. Now, also maybe this could be because Larry is just inexperienced in using the CB radio, and he is here trying to operate the other line and trying to speak to the operator on the other line, and then he mistakenly changes the channel. That could be an explanation here, but it's very uncertain. However, it is important to note that when other operators got in touch with Larry, he still would not give his last name, which would be an extremely vital piece of information, because if they could have cross-referenced that with missing persons cases in the area, we could then see if this whole thing was legit, and that if somebody actually reported Larry missing, we would have evidence to support that. But Larry never gave his last name, and we don't have any evidence of anybody with the name Larry disappearing during this time period. But again, we will circle all back to this in the theory section. Now, on Wednesday the 8th, the following day after the first broadcast, a CB operator named Linda King, who went by her CB handle of Blue Eyes, was able to make extended contact with Larry over the radio. This was kind of a breakthrough, as she was able to win over Larry's trust. She was also able to sustain longer conversations than many members of the general public could at this point. Larry goes on to tell Linda over the radio the full story of how he came to rest in the overturned truck. He tells Linda that he was off on a hunting trip with his dad in the New Mexico mountains in a red pickup truck when his dad suffered a heart attack at the wheel and the truck overturned into a ravine. Larry thought for sure that his father had died and that he was still trapped in the truck with no food or water. Larry goes on and does mention to Linda at one point that he is not super familiar with how the CB radio works, and that could be the explanation for the channel hopping if this case is in fact real. Like many of the other people who had talked to Larry, Larry refused to give Linda his last name. Now, during this same Wednesday, more searches were being mobilized with the New Mexico State Police, the New Mexico Civil Air Patrol, the Albuquerque Citizens Radio Association, and numerous civilian volunteers were started divvying up chunks of search area to start looking for the missing boy. In addition to what I just mentioned with the listening stations, other stations were additionally set up in neighboring states once they started realizing that Larry's message was casting well past the borders of New Mexico. Now, the Civil Air Patrol started searching the southern side of the state, while the state police and the ACRA started searching the mountains by foot. Now, a lead did come out of this initial search, and it was reported on by the New York Times, and that being that one of these Civil Air Patrol pilots did spot an abandoned truck on the east side of the Manzano Mountains. Initially thinking that this could be it, this could be Larry, this was the lead they needed, they relayed their find back to the other searchers, and a helicopter was dispatched to this area to take a closer look at this truck. However, when they arrived, the truck was gone, and nowhere to be found. This lead seemingly dried up. The same day, a team of CB operators were able to actually get a trace on where Larry's signal was coming from, and they were able to trace his signal to south of a concrete plant and near Harris Canyon. When they got this location, search teams were instantly mobilized with air support and search teams on foot to search that area as well. Then New Mexico Governor Bruce King was able to secure more search planes from the National Guard to assist in this search near Harris Canyon. One of these pilots in these National Guard planes was Captain Rick Tweed, who did say he was able to hear Larry's broadcasts from the cockpit of his U-21 aircraft. He was able to have a conversation with Larry, and he calmed Larry down and was quoted as saying this to Larry: "We're going to get you something to eat. We are going to find you. I'm going to find you myself, and I'll get you a double Mac." Now, you would think it is Captain Tweed, he was able to hear his broadcast, that they might have been on the right track, right? That they were following the right leads, that they were at least somewhat close, and that if this was the case, they would have found something and they would have found him. But that's where you would be wrong. On a side note, I'm also not familiar with the double Mac. I've never seen one before or had one, and then when I Googled it, good God, that's a lot of food. But that's besides the point. Now, when they searched this area south of the concrete plant, they found an assortment of discarded trucks and junk, but no sign of an overturned red truck or young boy. Now, during this part in the search and in the following day or so, Linda was still in regular communication with Larry, and Larry told Linda that it had just started raining outside, and it did for quite some time. During this time period, an aircraft was flying around and searching the area, and Linda told Larry that if he could see the lights from this aircraft in the sky, which were turned on specifically as they were looking for him, to start yelling, in which Larry did, and he stated that he could see the plane. However, the search of that new area also came up empty-handed. Now, you would also think that, in fact, if an airplane was searching this area overhead, and Larry said that he could see the plane and he could see the lights, that it would make sense that he was somewhat nearby, or at least within that general area. But of course, just like every bit of this story so far, his location seemingly continues to elude searchers who have continued to look for him night and day. Now, all of this that we have just talked about begs the question that time and time again, when it seems like a search is narrowed down, it really isn't, and Larry is nowhere to be found. At this point, people started to suspect that maybe this was a prank, but CB operators who spoke to Larry did not think that this was the case. Now, of course, some doubt has been cast on the testimonies from these operators, but many still think that this was a real boy. Now, an unnamed Army sergeant went on record to the press and stated that he had talked with Larry for over 3 hours, and thought for sure that this was not a prank, but a genuine lost boy. Sergeant W.A. Schmidt of the Civil Air Patrol also told reporters that if you had heard the boys' cries for help, you would think that they were the real deal. He was quoted as saying, and I quote, "I personally have never had any doubt that this is the real thing. I heard the kid crying. I just can't believe it isn't the real thing." Now, as the search lingered into Thursday with no real leads to speak of, searchers began having other problems. Their walkie-talkies were going crazy, but for the wrong reasons. Because of the extensive media coverage of this entire event, some kids decided that it'd be a great idea, not really, to start plastering the airwaves with prank impressions of Larry, as well as some trying to get in touch with Larry in general to tell him that he was going to die out there, which is pretty fucked up. And honestly, kids are shitty, and they can be really shitty at times, but that's a whole new level of shitty, if you ask me. Now, because of all of this, it made everything 10 times harder, because if Larry was still on the other end of the radio signal, his voice could be getting drowned out by the pranksters. Now, the search slowly turned from planned and methodical to desperate, and clinging for any shred of evidence that Larry was even out there. And with the media circus going on from local and national papers, it made everything worse. People all across the country were calling into New Mexico State Police, trying to give them hints about where Larry was, and they were pretty much all useless. There was even an instance of a psychic calling from a phone booth claiming to have tracked Larry to the town of Moriarty, New Mexico, through their psychic abilities, and of course that was a complete dead end. You even had a youth religious group out of Kansas calling in and said that they knew Larry was safe and that they knew his location because they had been praying and they got a message from God that he would be found safe in Kansas. Which, that just makes zero fucking sense. And it just kind of goes to show you the extent that the word had traveled around about this case. And none of it was actually helping. And you can kind of see that in modern times, currently, with very high profile missing persons case, that, they still have to sift through tons and tons of tips that really aren't worth anything, but you don't want to not overturn those because you don't know if there's a genuine tip in those. So you kind of see that in modern times, but this is probably one of the first cases that I've done research into where you see that to a full extent of just people just submitting tips and tips and tips, and it's like there's no evidence for these tips, but you got to sort through them because you don't know if there actually is something. But again, these weren't worth anything because they were just piggybacking off the publicity that this case was getting. And by Friday the 9th, search parties were exhausted, and the lack of communication was apparent. Certain volunteer search teams were checking the same areas of each other, and it was just a very large mess. In addition, Larry's messages became few and far between. Now, perhaps that could be that the CB radio in the truck was finally running out of juice. However, a lead would come in later that Friday when a man picked up a message from a young boy over the CB radio who this time said his name was David. Remember, like back during the first call with Darlene? Now, we hear the name David, and this time the child said he was okay, and that his truck with his father was overturned, but his dad was alive. However, this lead wouldn't be much of a lead, as the message was traced back to a young boy in Phoenix who was just messing around with his walkie-talkie and pulling a prank. Now, another development would take place in the form of a missing person getting reported to the Santa Fe Police Department, and that being a 12-year-old boy also by the name of Larry, and his parents being missing as well. Now, at first the police were unsure of the connection, so they pursued it. Turns out the family had just moved to New Mexico from Ohio, and when the family embarked on a long camping trip, they just didn't tell any of their relatives, so they chalked this up to being a completely separate Larry, not one that's tied into the Lost Boy Larry broadcast whatsoever, and just completely unrelated. In addition to this, another broadcast was picked up by a group of CB operators out of Colorado who were staying updated with the case when they found a wrinkle in the whole story, when they heard a transmission come through in regards to someone telling a group of their friends that they had just done an elaborate prank to fool the New Mexico State Police. One of these operators in Colorado decided to challenge the man's claims on the other end of the line, not sure if they had some sort of tie-in with the Lost Boy Larry case. When challenged, the man on the other end of the line threatened to kill the CB operator, and for good measure, also threatened to kill President Richard Nixon and Vice President Spiro Agnew. Just for good measure, I guess? But also the man on the radio had a Mexican accent and Larry did not. Perhaps this was just another prankster. But again, it shows the length of how much attention this case gained, and if in fact Larry was still out there and was real and was waiting to be found, all this negative attention and pranksters and red herrings wasted the time of the investigators and wasted the time that they did have in terms of searching, but by this point, they were extremely burnt out. After 4 days of searching, the physical search was called off. However, many listening stations stayed on for extended weeks for any faint traces of Larry again. It did end up being one of the most expensive searches ever done within the United States up to this point, and to come up with absolutely nothing was pretty disappointing. The fact that Larry again never gave his last name or approximate details on where the truck overturned led investigators in circles, with really no idea where the boy could actually be, and with the search parties slowly falling apart due to lack of leadership and planning on those third and fourth days, all around, it was a massive failure. Between the law enforcement, military, civilian searches, and the multiple aircraft used, it came to an estimated $120,000 in 1973, which is roughly $850,000 when adjusted to today's money, not counting the unpaid volunteer hours. After the search was called off, no one ever found Larry, and his broadcasts faded from the airwaves, but it left a mystery behind on whether or not this was an actual hoax or this was a real boy. Authorities, due to this lack of evidence, even saying that he existed in the first place, they were quick to label this as a hoax. They did not buy into this theory that Larry was an actual boy, that he was actually lost out there, just because of the lack of evidence. Come November of that year, State Police Chief Martin Vigil made the following announcement to reporters in regards to the case by saying, and I quote, "We have not come up with any real definitive information to establish that the situation is valid. We have not come up with any information that is definite enough to say that there is actually someone out there, and in fact, where this person might be." But in fact, if this was a hoax, we are left with numerous unanswered questions in regards to this whole case, such as, why was Larry so stubborn and evasive when it came to providing details like his last name and rough location? Why did he constantly switch the channel on the radio? Was this strictly inexperience? Or maybe he was perhaps trying to avoid the police from tracing his channel because this was a hoax? And why in over 50 years have we not found the overturned red truck if in case this was real? I mean, we were also able to quickly identify the hoaxes from other kids because the jig would usually be up after 10 minutes or so. But if this was a hoax, this is not the case. This was dragged out and planned, and if this was a hoax, Larry was a very good actor. In addition to this, what 7-year-old child would have free access to a CB radio for that long over that many days if this was a kid planning some sort of prank? And why does the name David repeatedly come up when the boy's name is Larry? Maybe Larry was a cover name and David was the hoaxer's real name, or perhaps somebody else present for the hoax's name? And if the truck was overturned like Larry said it was, wouldn't the CB radio antenna would have been on top of the truck and most certainly crushed when it flipped over? Right? You would think so anyway. Now, we have all these questions that we really, to this day, don't have answers for, and it helped perpetuate the whole mystery of this entire thing. But perhaps what is more interesting is a missing persons case that I stumbled upon in doing my research. That even though I don't think it's connected, I think the story of this missing child inspired the story of the Lost Boy broadcasts. Now, I want to go over the missing persons case of David Mera. David was born to a mother named Jeannie Mera and Leon Zerfas. It turns out that Leon was a pretty shitty dad. He would regularly cheat on his wife, and by the time he had David, he already had another illegitimate child. Now, during the time of David's disappearance, Jeannie was giving birth to a daughter named Elia in one of the hospitals near Dixon, New Mexico. Now, while she was giving birth, Leon took David on January 10th, 1970, and David was never seen again. They were last seen in front of the hospital, and it is rumored that they either left the hospital on foot or rode in a faded green 1946 Chevy pickup. Now, when Jeannie got out of the hospital on the 12th and arrived home, David's belongings and toys were all gone. And when she confronted Leon, Leon claimed that he had given the baby away. One story claimed it was to his sister in Mexico. One story had it being a pair of college grads who were from the eastern part of the United States, or even a photographer. But none of these stories have ever been confirmed, and David remains missing to this day. Many people within Jeannie's family think that Leon killed the child, although the motive for that would remain unclear. At the time of the disappearance, he was only 3 years old. Now, if you fast forward to 1973, in which the Lost Boy Larry broadcasts take place, that would roughly put David's age at 6 to 7 years old. If, of course, he was alive during this time period, that is, anyway. Now, do I think that David and Larry are the same person? No, I don't. But I do think that perhaps somebody reading this fairly recent case of a missing child was a perfect blank canvas to maybe get back at the New Mexico State Police for some type of wrongdoing. Again, there is a connection there with the missing person, David Mera, sharing the name that gets repeatedly brought up in the Lost Boy Larry broadcast, and that is David. And we can't figure out who Larry referred to as David. Obviously, we had a prankster also refer to themselves as David and then kind of copy and paste the same story that Larry was saying over the radio. So David has come up repeatedly. And I think that the inspiration from this missing persons case of David, they read this entire case and they're like, hey, we could use this. Maybe we can make up this some type of story that his dad took him into the desert and everything like that. Even the pickup's the same. Color's a little bit different, but the pickup matches as well. You know, I don't know if it was ever a Chevy pickup. I don't think Larry ever specified what the brand of pickup truck was. So that part kind of still remains in question. But I think that this missing persons case influenced the Lost Boy Larry broadcast in terms of kind of plot and storytelling, if that makes any sense. But with that being said, obviously I kind of sprinkled my own personal thoughts in there just now, but I want to go into theories as well, and there's really only two theories to really go off of here. And that being that the first theory is that this is real, and that Larry was a real person, and somehow he was completely missed and left to die out there in the New Mexico desert. Now, the evidence doesn't point to this, and the lack of evidence doesn't tell us that in this case that he didn't exist. And you would think that after 50 years, we would have some type of something, anything, some type of lead, maybe the truck, something. After 50 years, you would think we would have some type of evidence that would point us in the direction of either locating the truck or locating the remains of Larry, especially with the advancements in kind of geo-mapping and then like satellite tech and Google Maps and everything like that. I feel like we would have found something, and we have found absolutely nothing to this day. Now, of course, our second theory is that this is a hoax, and that this is a cut and dry hoax made up by an actor to get back at the system. Maybe the system in question here would be the New Mexico State Police. Now, kind of what the CB operators in Colorado picked up, could that have been the real perpetrators of the hoax, and the rest of the broadcasts were just greedy kids also clutching their CB radios to try and get a piece of the action? Who knows, really? But maybe they did take inspiration from the case of David Mera to help inspire them to create this elaborate hoax. Maybe this was some type of aspiring actor who planned and created this lie as some sort of test of his acting chops. Who knows? We have zero evidence pointing us in any direction, and the case of the Lost Boy Larry broadcast remains one of the most intriguing and perplexing, I guess you could say, quote-unquote, missing persons cases in the whole United States. With that being said, my personal thoughts on this matter is that I think this was a hoax. In doing all of this research, there was nothing that led me down the path to think that this was real. Of course, if this was real, I would have hoped that there would have been some type of evidence to point us in a direction that Lost Boy Larry was still out there and he was just waiting to be found. But between the kind of, I guess if you want to call it shady info of Larry not trying to tell the CB operator his last name or his location. I think that even if this was a real boy and he had a very minuscule amount of information with the CB radio, and maybe, let's just make this up for shits and giggles here and say, maybe his parents said, oh, if you use a CB radio, use an alias. Okay, that would make sense. But if you dive deeper into that, if it is a life and death situation, again, I'm not a 7-year-old boy, but if it's a life and death situation, you would think that would go out the window and you would just want to be found at that point. You want to be found alive, you want to make it through, and you would think eventually that if he did say, okay, I got to use an alias if I try and talk to people on the CB radio, and then, pretty much just go from there. I know I'm kind of ranting here, but I don't see any universe where this is real, because, again, there's just no evidence. I'm a very factual-based person. I'm a very evidence-based person. Of course, I like to branch myself out there with the crazy theories sometimes, but this, to me, just seems so much like a hoax, and I genuinely think that the case of David Miera inspired this case. Again, in terms of plot points and storytelling and things like that, of course, the truck overturning and into the ravine and using the CB radio, that part was obviously made up for the story. But it also goes back to the point that I mentioned earlier that, if the truck did in fact roll over, wouldn't the CB radio antenna be broken if the truck rolled over and the antenna was on top of the truck? That, to me, also kind of calls in question. That, to me, seems more of a smoking gun, like this didn't actually happen. Or, maybe the truck didn't overturn. I don't know. There's a lot of unanswered questions in this, and in my personal theory, I think that this was fake. I think somebody staged this, planned it out, to get back at maybe the New Mexico State Police or the New Mexico government for reasons unknown. I could go on and theorize about why somebody would want to get back at the New Mexico State Police, but to be honest with you, you never know. You don't know if this, if the original prankster's intention was to waste all the state's resources or anything like that. You just don't know. But unfortunately, I'm gonna have to go with that this is a hoax, and obviously that's not the fun theory, but I do think that this is a hoax. Now, if you have done any of your own research into this topic and I happen to miss something, feel free to send that to me at unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. You can also Instagram direct message me. You can put it under YouTube in a comment section. Any way you want to get in touch with me in terms of something that I might have missed, feel free to send that to me. I'm not perfect by any means, and I do miss things. So if you do have some additional information for me, I greatly appreciate it. But with that being said, that is going to conclude today's episode on the Lost Boy Larry broadcast. I hope you all enjoyed it. And again, this was a topic suggestion. So if you do happen to have topic suggestions to me, you can send them to my email, or you can direct message me on Instagram to get those to me. Now, my email is going to be unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. You can send those straight to me. This episode is a testament that I take your topic suggestions and I add them to the queue, and I try to get to them as quick as I possibly can. Now, if you're listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. And if you happen to be listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out with the algorithm gods, and I greatly appreciate it. But with that being said, you can also check me out on Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown and TikTok, Unblurring the Unknown as well, for additional content and cover art for this week's episode. But with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode on the Lost Boy Larry broadcast, and I will see you all on the next one.